Hi, I'm Josh McGrath,
I'm Andrew Haas.
and this is the Ardent Pursuit Podcast. One of the most common questions we've received from men since starting this podcast is, how do I find a good wife? Where do I look for a godly woman? And so today what we want to do is explore 3 myths that are common among single men, and then give some very practical steps on how you as a single man who wants to be married can be creative in your search for a wife. So Andrew, I'll unpack myth number 1 here. Feel free to jump in because this is a big idea that we're going to try to be sensitive to, but it is a controversial idea. And the myth is this: because I'm believing for a good and godly thing, God will give it to me.
Mm-hmm.
So we're talking about marriage, finding a wife. And this is a sentiment that a lot of Christians, men and women, hold. They believe that because they desire to be married, which is a good and godly desire, that God will grant it to them. And the reality is, when we look through Scripture, there is no promise or guarantee of marriage for men or for women. And it can be very challenging and hard when year after year you're hoping for, dreaming for, desiring marriage, and it doesn't happen. And from the male perspective, it's definitely a bit easier. We have a longer runway than women, because women who oftentimes desire marriage desire so for the sake of having children. And so they're aware of the biological reality, the biological window that they have to produce offspring. And so as a man, who enters his 30s, late 30s, 40s, late 40s, you're not necessarily thinking as the guy, oh, wow, I have to be married right away because the dream of family is dying. But if you're a woman in your 30s and then into your 40s, the dream, hope, and vision of marriage and a family is looking different every single year that goes by that you don't find yourself married. And this is a hard reality to accept as a man or as a woman, particularly if it's been years that you've been waiting and hopeful that you'll find the one, so to speak. You'll find a wife, you'll find a husband, and that you'll be able to be married. This is a very hard and difficult reality to continue to live out as a believer.
And there's a biblical parallel here even with children. We know that children are a blessing. I know firsthand they are a huge blessing. And many men might desire to be fathers, have children, but even within marriage, even if you are blessed with a wife, there is still no promise or guarantee that you will be blessed with children. That is an unfortunate reality for a lot of couples today. And so this is just to help frame the idea that just because something is good and biblical and even designed by God to happen does not necessarily mean it will.
That's a really good example that we actually see throughout, even the Old Testament, where there are these moments where women deeply desire children but are unable to have it. And God steps in to space and time and he opens the womb. Or in a very, prominent case with David's wife, when she made fun of him for dancing before the Lord, actually closed her womb. And so, children are a heritage of the Lord. The fruit of the womb is a blessing, but it's not guaranteed. And he who finds a wife finds a good thing and obtains favor from the Lord, but it's not a guaranteed thing. And another example that I think, from the Bible is this idea of healing. We see in James the call to bring the elders in to lay hands on anyone who's sick, that the Lord might heal them. And yes, healing's a biblical idea. It's something that should be pursued, but it's not guaranteed. And so how do we reconcile these godly desires with a current reality that is not that? And it's this tension of already but not yet. The tension of realizing that God is one who redeems, but the final redemption isn't until his return. So while we may desire marriage, while we may desire children, while we may desire healing, it's so important that we orient ourselves, our expectation, and our faith in Christ and who he is, what he's done on the cross, and the guarantee of his return rather than on a specific outcome.
And the more time that passes, the more careful men need to become of, there's the temptation to become angry or disappointed or upset at yourself, at God, at others, at other women, heaven forbid. If life doesn't play out as we had hoped or expected, there are these temptations that men really need to watch out for.
And this becomes a weighty reality for a lot of Christians, particularly as they age. Particularly for women who are very aware of, the biological window. And so if they have a desire to be a wife and then to be a mother, and the years are passing and they're entering their 30s into their 40s, that dream, that hope, that desire is now taking on a different shape every passing year that they remain single. And, not in the same exact way, obviously men have a much longer, runway of time to be thinking about becoming fathers. But a man who desires deeply to be married, to be a husband, to be a father, each passing year, it can become, harder to continue to believe God for good things. And the tension for the believer is saying, hey, I'm believing God for a good thing, but my life, my service to the Lord, my involvement in my local church, my call to be holy as Christ is holy is not dependent upon receiving that good thing.
And men need to just recognize and be aware of what their involvement is. We know that we don't just sit around and wait. Wait for the wife to come walking by one day.
That doesn't happen ever.
That never happens. It also won't happen where you just go find the first woman you're attracted to and vice versa. And you get married.
It's true, because Proverbs 18 says, he who finds a wife finds a good thing. There is a process of working together. It's not just the man goes out and grabs the first woman he sees on the street and is like, you're my wife. Obviously, that's a felony and you should probably go to jail for that. Don't do that. So there's a working with the Lord. Again, we see this in Psalm, unless the Lord builds a house, the workman labors in vain. There's this process by which God has allowed himself to partner with broken, sinful humans to accomplish his plans and purposes here on earth. And so you need God to help build the house, but the workman's got to build the house.
You actually got to start building.
And so in the same way, when it comes to finding a wife, there's work that men need to do, but it has to be in partnership with the Lord.
And myth number 2 is this: if I move, I will find someone. While that could certainly open some new doors, there's the temptation to think I'm still single because I just simply haven't moved to a new area with more people.
I think a lot of guys tend to think that if they just move to a more populated area or a different area, that guarantees them to find somebody that they can marry. And the reality is that 30% of adults aged 18 to 34 are actually living at home with their parents, and that 80% of adults only move within 100 miles of their home. So while you're thinking, I just need to move to a different location because it means I'll find someone, it's like, well, you might find someone, but it's not a guarantee. And I think the myth that, it's kind of the carrot at the end of the stick is, well, if I just keep moving, eventually, statistically, my odds are I'm going to find someone. And it's like, no, it actually isn't guaranteed.
Right. You could spend a lifetime just moving from A to B to C, chasing that elusive outcome, and it may never happen. What men need to be cautious of is pursuing new locations on the expectation that you will find a spouse, what could happen? You know, you move somewhere, you meet a lot of great people. Well, one, you could meet a lot of great people, and that could further instill this idea of, oh wow, there's great people here. What else am I missing out on?
Yep.
Or it can be the other side of the coin. You can move to a new place, and in today's age of social media and, you know, just kind of the mess we're in, it's hard to connect with people.
Yeah.
And so you could very likely move to a new area and really struggle to meet people, to connect with people. So just simply moving somewhere does not in any way guarantee that you'll have higher chances.
It's true. Now, myth number 3 is this idea that there are no good or godly women. Another way to put this that I've seen, particularly online, is where are all the godly women? Or flipped, where are all the godly men? And there seems to be this belief that all the good godly women are like the Amazonian women from Wonder Woman. They're all on this island that no one can find. And it's like, where is this elusive island full of good godly women? And we want to dispel this myth, because the reality is that for 99% of our listeners, there are good and godly women in their life somewhere. Now, here is the controversy. You just may not be attracted to what is good. You may not be attracted to what is godly. Meaning that the good godly woman, she has all these great biblical traits that would make for a great wife or a great mother, and you're just not attracted to her, either because of her personality or her looks. And this is what's really important for men to recognize, that a good and godly woman is more than just her looks and her personality. But here's what's also important. Looks and personality matter.
Yes, they do.
And so we want our listeners to be aware that there are good and godly women all over the place. And statistically, there's more of them in your local church than there are good godly men. That's just statistically across the board in America. So don't confuse what you're attracted to with the notion that there are no good and godly women in your life.
And I would even say that pornography can warp this whole idea. You know, it's like when you live on junk food, or even the standard American diet. You grow up on certain foods, and then the day comes when you try to eat healthier, you try to shift, and the foods that are actually good for you, that would actually taste good had you been acclimated to them, aren't really interesting at first. There's a process. And so for a lot of guys, especially if pornography is part of your past, that is going to totally warp and change what you think is good and attractive. And so to your point, there could be some very solid quality women that you just don't find attractive simply because of your past.
It's true. I'll take that, kind of one step further in the fact that, like, even if, you're not addicted to pornography or it's not a thing of your past, if you're on social media or you watch movies or TV, it is before you in some shape or form. It's some type of, woman who is probably the exception to the rule when it comes to beauty standards. Very possibly even unhealthy beauty standards.
Yes.
And so you're fed through, whether it's the algorithm or certain TV shows or movies that you're consuming, a presentation of a woman that just is not real. And so your brain associates beauty with a particular beauty standard that is categorically not common or maybe even not healthy. And so now you're looking at the good godly women in your community and you're like, well, they don't look like this girl. It's like, well, yeah, because A, that girl's probably the 1% or the 0.5% of women in existence. And B, it's possible that her standard of beauty is actually unhealthy. I think about, men in like particularly like superhero movies who have to get in shape. And I remember watching this interview with Hugh Jackman. for the last X-Men that he did, or last Wolverine that he did. And he, does this entire scene where he's like shirtless, and his abs are just like cutting through, and it's amazing. And he's talking about how terrible it is because 24 hours before you film, you're not allowed to drink anything. You want to deplete your system so that your muscles really stand out while you shoot. And not only was he on this incredibly strict diet and working out for whatever 6 or 9 months leading up to the shoot, but then 24 hours before, you're not allowed to eat or drink anything. You're just talking about how terrible it is. But you watch the movie and you're like, oh, that's so amazing. I want to look like that. And it's like, okay, that is actually terrible and not sustainable. And that's a parallel to oftentimes the type of women that men consider attractive.
So on our recent trip to Europe, one of the things that stood out to me as I think we were walking through Paris, you walk through all these stores that there's, mannequins and models and just, fashion on display. And the recurring theme that I saw were all of these models that to me looked way too thin.
Sure.
And, if I didn't know better, I would think they were, anorexic.
Probably were.
Possibly, but that was or is the standard of beauty for at least some demographic.
Yeah.
And, if you're steeped in that, if that's what you're exposed to day in and day out, that's going to become the norm. That's what you will say, this is what beauty is. This is what should be beautiful.
Yeah.
Thankfully, that's not my daily exposure. And so it seemed foreign and even unattractive. I didn't see beauty in that. So for men to recognize that what you see as beauty or what you're attracted to could be highly influenced by what you've experienced.
It's true. And because men, we've talked about this before on the podcast, are visual creatures, the thing that oftentimes causes them to first notice a woman is her beauty. If the standard that you're using is an unhealthy or unrealistic beauty standard, you will view everyone else as unattractive. And you'll miss out on relationships with really amazing women. Now, again, we're not here to say, well, go find the first godly woman that you meet and marry her, because there are a lot of elements to attraction. It's not just the physical attraction, right? Personality really does matter. Commonalities matter. Background, history, beliefs, all of that matters. That all plays into attraction. But it's important for men to know, why is it that I'm not attracted to the good and godly women in my life? Is it simply because I have an unrealistic standard of what I'm attracted to? Or is there something deeper? Our personalities really don't match. They really don't get along. And this person I actually just truly am physically not attracted to in any way, shape, or form. And I can never be in a place where I would be physically attracted to them in any way, shape, or form. That's a reality. But I think in some cases, men have just written off good, godly women because they don't look like that Hollywood celebrity.
And it could be that for some men, simply getting to know women in your community, getting to know them better, could lead to something more.
Absolutely. Could lead to greater attraction.
Could, yeah. A guy could find himself at some point in the future more attracted to a woman that he was not previously attracted to simply through getting to know her.
And I think that's actually a really good point, because one of the things that men can do is by serving the local church, by serving in community. I'm getting a little ahead of ourselves with solutions here, but by being involved in things, you get to know people, and as you get to know people, you can become attracted to them. I think about Luke and Kat, the couple that we had on several episodes ago.
Right.
They got to know each other through hiking, and that's where the attraction began to form, was through time together on hikes. And so had they never spent time going on hikes together, they would have never gotten to know each other, which would not have increased the attraction level. And so you're absolutely right. By spending time with people, you can build attraction. That doesn't mean invite over the first girl in church that you know to your house to watch the Lord of the Rings marathon. Not the way to do it.
Don't do that.
That's sketchy, and your pastor should talk to you. But there are ways to spend time with good, godly women in a community environment that may increase your attraction to them.
And that is one of the pitfalls of, social media, or maybe even dating apps in particular.
Sure.
Is that the entire existence of, who you might be interested in or attracted to is just reduced to appearance.
Yeah.
And yes, it plays a role, but when it becomes the only thing or by far the most important thing, that's when things get really skewed.
Now, a quick aside before we move on that I know we didn't plan on talking about, but for our female listeners, I think it's important for them to remember that they have a role and responsibility in caring for their body and looking presentable. We were just talking about unhealthy beauty standards in a culture, and I want to make sure our female listeners know that the call is not to try to become an unhealthy standard of beauty. The goal is to be healthy. We're called as believers to steward the temple of the Lord, our bodies. And so there's a responsibility that we all have. Right now, I'm going to speak to our female listeners to steward well our body, to make sure that we're not grotesquely overweight, to make sure that we're wearing, outfits and clothes that fit us appropriately and help you look feminine and beautiful, to care for yourself, to shower, to tend to your hair. The goal is not to look like you just walked off the Hollywood red carpet, but the goal is also not to look like you've been farming out in the field for the last 12 years.
Because here's something that is true for the vast majority of, I'll say men and women, that the more healthy you become, the more attractive you will be.
Yeah.
Both physically, emotionally, you're going to have better habits and lifestyle, better routines, and those sort of things are going to make you a more attractive person. And so, yeah, the healthier you become, you will, by definition almost, become a more interesting person to others.
All right, let's continue on to talking about ways that men can expand their search to find a wife. And this is the thing that I know that we get a lot of questions on. So what are some of the practical ways I can find a wife? So the things we're going to offer here, it's not exhaustive, but I think they're actually very important and can be very helpful.
It's a starting point.
It's a starting point. All right, so the first thing is actually to utilize, this is going to shock our listeners, social media.
Oh boy.
I know. All right, let me explain this. There are, particularly on Instagram, accounts that are devoted to highlighting, to spotlighting single women and men who want to be in a relationship for the purpose of marriage. One of the most prominent ones that I'm aware of is called Saved Singles. And so it's an account where women and men, they're Christians, they're believers. They submit pictures of themselves. They submit a quick write-up and bio on themselves. They will even indicate not just their location, but whether they're open to long distance or not. And the whole purpose is to put themselves out there in hopes that, a woman or man would reach out to them. And so literally DMing them is appropriate. And it's expected because the goal is to find somebody that is attracted to them that they can begin a relationship with to see if it leads towards marriage. What a great way to leverage technology for positive outcomes.
Yeah. And obviously they're, proceed with caution, but, Instagram and other places could be a helpful place to find somebody.
I mean, that approach is going to be much healthier than just downloading dating apps and swiping,
Absolutely.
I don't know what it is, right or left or something. Swiping. A lot healthier than swiping.
Yes. Now, another place to look would be the trusted people in your life. So often, or more often I think than we realize, the people that know us well often have insights into us and other people that we don't have. And they wouldn't naturally come to us with that information. And so it's the responsibility of the guy to actually open that door, ask those questions. It could be your pastor, it could be a mentor, it could be best friend. Ask around and be like, hey, who do you think I would be a good partner for? That type of question. And by doing so, you invite input, and you'll have feedback, and you'll have comments that you otherwise would not get, and you will see things that you otherwise wouldn't see.
What I love about that is it kind of is a return back to a time not so long ago where people would set each other up on blind dates. And today, that's almost, looked upon as a bit taboo. Like, I would never go out on a date with a stranger. And what's great here is all the things you just highlighted actually are leveraged in your favor. It's somebody who knows you and knows somebody else. It is like, hey, I don't know for certain, but I think you guys could make a great pair. And it's a really safe way to meet other people that potentially could lead to a long-lasting relationship.
Yeah, at least don't rule it out. I
Yes.
mean, it may not go anywhere.
Yep.
But hey, at least open that door, see where it goes.
Absolutely. And I want to build off that because another way that you can expand your search is by going, you already mentioned it, to your pastor, but specifically asking him to reach out to other pastors, or if your church is part of a church network, asking him to reach out to that network. Pastors, whether they're the senior pastor, executive pastor, college minister, whatever, oftentimes are very aware of the, single numbers in their church. Pastors generally are pretty passionate about single people getting married. And so they're really aware of, who are the single guys, who are the single girls in my church. So if you go to your pastor and say, Pastor, can you reach out to the network of, whatever the other church is and ask their pastor if there's a woman in their church that they would recommend? It's kind of that Abraham, Old Testament, Abraham sending his trusted servant to go find a wife for Isaac. It's like, well, we're going to let the patriarch talk here behind the scenes about, well, here's her qualities, here's his qualities. Do we think that they're good together? But it's such a great way to expand your search because you know what? Maybe you end up driving or flying to another church, attending that Sunday morning, introducing yourself to the pastor, and the pastor calls you over and is like, hey, I want you to meet Susie over here. And suddenly there's an opportunity to connect with a woman that has been vouched for by a pastor. And she has the opportunity to connect with a man who's been vouched for by your pastor. Like, what a win.
Right, and arguably very minimal downside.
Yeah.
So again, it might not go anywhere, but at least it'll be closed off to the idea.
None of these are guarantees. They're merely tools to expand your search.
Yes. Now, another place you can look are on missions trips. It's a little cliche, but it happens. And the reason it happens, among other things, is that a missions setting often puts people in a place where they can exhibit traits and behaviors where they wouldn't normally.
Yeah.
And so it's almost like this ability to look into someone's life or see someone in a more full capacity where you wouldn't see otherwise. And kind of to an earlier comment where, as you get to know somebody, you might actually grow an attraction to them. A missions trip could be an accelerated version of that. You might know someone superficially or just, a little bit, but you want to trip with them. And all of a sudden you get to see way more of who they are, for good or bad. But at least gives you that opportunity to really see and observe, because a lot of attraction actually isn't through direct interaction.
Sure.
You see what they look like, but often attraction builds through how you watch them, how someone conducts themselves.
And I think the key here is to expand the search by going on missions trips that involve other churches or other groups. If you're just going on a missions trip with your own local church, I mean, that's great. That's awesome. But you may find there's not many more fish here on this missions trip. And depending on what type of church you go to, you might find there's no fish because all the women are 60 and older on that missions trip. So part of the way you expand it on a missions trip is looking for missions opportunities that involve people from multiple areas. And there are definitely, a lot of those out there.
Yes, and one word of caution, if the only reason you're signing up for missions trip is to find a wife.
Don't go.
Do not go.
Stay home.
Do not pass go.
Yeah.
You will have a bad time. You will probably make others have a bad time.
You will probably be kicked off the team.
Yes. Sent home early. Okay, don't do that.
So true. That's excellent advice. Now, the final way that we're going to encourage you to expand your search is by being involved in whether it's community activities, other church activities, things like, 5Ks, running clubs, book clubs, board game clubs, being part of local theater, being part of, serving an ecumenical, caring for the community type day. It's by being involved in other arenas where you will likely expand your opportunity to meet other people that you may be able to enter into a relationship with.
Yeah, too much of life is unfortunately done in isolation. You might go to your work, you get to know your coworkers well, perhaps you go to church, or perhaps you might spend your weekend with some friends. But too often we fall into these routines, and modern living has not played in our favor in this capacity. So just get out there and try new things, engage in new ways, find groups, find people to engage with. And there might not be something there, but when you establish that pattern, when that just becomes more natural to you, as those opportunities come to you, you will more readily engage with them. And that's just going to open up a lot of doors.
So these are, the ways that we're recommending men expand their search to find a wife. I want to quickly talk about a parallel, just, kind of example that highlights the importance and reasons why men who want to be married must initiate and be creative in, pursuing a wife. So the example is this, and this is a common one that, particularly for Christians are familiar with. I feel God has called me to be a missionary. Okay, many people have felt that call. Great, awesome. And so I'm at home and I'm like, God has called me to that. And I actually desire that. I desire to be a missionary. Great, good call, good desire. And I just sit at home. So someone asked me, well, Josh, do you have a passport? No, I don't have a passport. Okay. Are you saving up money for a mission trip? Oh, no. God will provide when the time comes. Are you studying about missions or other missionaries? No, I don't have time to be reading about that. Are you praying for other countries? Has God laid a country in your heart? No, just, he'll open up the doors when the time comes. Now, from an outside perspective, that's just silly. And any solid believer would look at that and say, well, clearly you don't desire it, and clearly God hasn't called you to it if you're not willing to take any action. But in the same way, when it comes to wanting to be in a relationship, wanting to be married, men will often be like, well, I desire a wife, and I want to be married. And that's as far as it goes. Lord, I'm going to go to church, or I'm going to go to work, or I'm going to live here. I'm not going to change anything about my life, but I want to be married. This one's on you. And God's like, well, what are you doing? It's like, God, this one's on you. I am here. Send her my way. Drop her from heaven. And, there's all these videos on Instagram of, how Christian introverts believe they're going to find their spouse. And it's them sitting at home being like, God, you're going to provide. And suddenly there's a knock at the door. They open up the door. There she is. And she's like, I just feel like God has called me to marry you. And they're like, welcome. And it's like, it's tongue in cheek. It's a joke. But it really does highlight that so many men believe that they don't need to do anything. They can just continue to do what they're doing every single day. They don't have to be creative. They don't have to go out searching. They don't have to go out finding a wife. That God is just going to magically bring her to him. And if that is what you are waiting for, you will be 90 years old and waiting magically for your wife to appear.
And I like the phrasing you just used, creatively looking for somebody, because, it's not just, oh, hey, I'm going to work every day, or I go to church twice a week, and I'm just waiting for the right one to come to church. Yeah. It's like, okay, that could happen.
It could.
But for guys to just, get creative. If you want to get married, think of creative ways to go meet new people.
So let's talk about some next steps. Last week, we talked about the importance of being a man of action, actually doing something. You can have lofty visions, hopes, and dreams, but unless you actually do something, take the next step, all there'll be is lofty hopes and dreams on paper.
And a great question every guy should be asking themselves is, am I becoming the type of man that the type of woman I want would want? It's a bit confusing.
Unpack that for me.
Are you the kind of quality man that a quality woman would find attractive? If you want a high caliber woman, make sure you're a high caliber man. And if you're not, start today, right? Start going down that road. Think about, what do I need to do to become a high caliber man so that the type of woman that I'm interested in she's also going to be interested in me.
That is excellent advice. If more men began to implement that in their lives, I think we'd see an increase of relationships and marriages in our culture, which would be awesome. Something else that when it comes to next steps that men need to do is to understand where their attraction is being placed. Is it being placed in simply physical appearance? Is it being placed simply in personality? Is it being placed simply in abilities and talents? Is it being placed in background or family? Or is it being placed in the biblical standard of what makes a godly wife? Because, again, attraction is important. Personality absolutely is important. But it's very easy for men to weight that so heavily that literally their only standard is she's hot.
Exactly. Yeah, too often we make it like, 90% of the pie, and it's certainly a slice.
It's a big slice.
It's a big slice.
But it's not
Absolutely.
90%.
It is not 90%.
I don't know what percent it is. It's pretty high.
For most men, it is pretty high. And the cool thing is, though, is that actually as time goes on, that slice gets smaller and smaller. As you fully get to know somebody, you are more attracted to other aspects of them that you had no idea existed.
Yeah.
And so by definition, the physical just takes up less of that attraction realm. But yes, men need to have an appropriate and realistic view of where physical attraction falls.
The final next step is, particularly for men of faith, to ask God for guidance. Again, while marriage is not guaranteed, God is a good God. He desires good things for his children. And so if you have the desire to be married as a man, go to God with that desire and ask him to give you wisdom, direction, and creativity on how to find a wife. Don't let your prayer just be, God, bring me a wife. That's the wrong prayer to be praying. You're going to be praying that prayer a very, very, very long time. Turn that around into saying, God, what can I do to find a wife? What do I need to change to find a wife? And God is a God of creativity. And we talked about that a couple episodes ago. And so you're going to find that as you pray that prayer, God's going to give you insight into creative ways to reach out in hopes of finding a wife.
And it's about finding balance in those pursuits in your life. If you set aside basically everything you're doing and solely orient yourself around finding a wife. And, it's like, hey, I'm unhealthy. I want to get healthier. A lot of people do allocate a huge portion of their life to getting healthy, depending on your circumstances. But for most people, it's going to be, I buy different things at the grocery store, or I start exercising more. Little shifts here and there. And so that's more or less how men should orient themselves. There are action steps I need to take. This isn't a set aside your life until you find a wife. It's no, your life is going to continue. You keep doing the things you're called to and possibly make a few changes in the pursuit of finding a wife.
That's so good. And I think it's actually a really good place to conclude today's conversation. So, gentlemen, 3 things we want you to do. Number 1, be a man of action. If you desire to be married, stop doing the same thing that you're doing now. Look for new creative means by which to pursue a wife. Remember, the definition of insanity is this: doing the same thing over and over again, but expecting different results. Look for ways to enlarge your circle in order to hopefully find a wife. Number 2, finding a wife doesn't happen by luck. It actually takes work. It takes ambition. Remember, the scripture says, he who finds a wife finds a good thing. You don't just find a wife by going to church and the Lord plopping down a woman next to you. That just isn't the story for like 99.9999% of all people. There's going to be effort on your part. Put in the effort to find a wife. And finally, number 3, stop complaining. Men, it's so easy to complain, but it's also so unattractive. Stop complaining about, well, there are no good women, there are no godly women, there are no women, period. Look, that's just not true. What you need to do is make your focus about God and his kingdom, focus on growing as a man and as a believer, and trust that the Lord will guide and lead you as he wills. As always, we love having you here on the Art and Pursuit podcast, and we look forward to having you here next time.